Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Happy Juneteenth to everybody. Yesterday, we did a deep dive with my friend Francis Durnley from The Telegraph on British and European politics. It was the sort of rank punditry that has the vague odor of European cheeses, and so in an attempt to compensate, I decided that it would be good to have someone who could do something similar with breadth and depth on the American scene. And there are a few better than my friend and colleague, Matt Continetti from the American Enterprise Institute. Some of you may have heard him speak for 2, sometimes even 3 sentences in a row on the Commentary podcast. And today you're going to get to hear 6 times that. So, Matt, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jonah. It's great to be here. Great to talk at length.
Yeah, I mean, that alone almost hit a personal best.
Yeah, I feel so happy. I'm free.
I don't know why I always ask for updates about this, but since you've gone to become one of the suits at AEI, you are now management in that other weird shop that just has like chickens running across the floor and ladies in babushkas walking around. How's it going over there?
Well, I think things are pretty good at AEI. I mean, I am the director of domestic policy studies, so that means I supervise and lead teams involving education policy, housing policy, opportunity and social mobility, and also our new Center for Technology, Science, and Energy. And we're turning out some pretty interesting stuff. I'm very happy to have our new colleague, Roger Pielke Jr., who's just an excellent writer and political scientist and analyst of climate science, and comes at it with a very skeptical attitude, but also aware that there are challenges that we have to reckon with and deal with. So it's a realistic posture. My colleagues in the education policy team are just doing incredible work, whether it's the chronic absenteeism that our friend and colleague Nat Malkus is working on. Rick Hess just released earlier this year a book co-authored with Mike McShane on the conservative approach to education at all levels.
We had them on the Remnant to talk about it.
Yeah, good. So that's a good book. So we're doing well, I think. And what's important, I think, for a think tank to be a presence in the public square, and also be influential in policy debates, and third and most important, be mission aligned and understand the values it holds. At AEI, we're for opportunity, we're for enterprise, we're for American leadership in the world. And I think we're doing all of those things at AEI, so I'm happy to be there.
Yeah, and we, unlike some other prominent think tanks, don't fly the American flag upside down.
I checked; the flag was right side up.
Yeah,
all the flags.
Yeah, I should get Pielke on here. Followed his stuff for years. And,
he'd be great.
I mean, the thing I know most, the way I differentiate your shop from, the shop that you used to be a member of before we had to have you drummed out like a prison gang.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before you exiled me like Virgil.
Or discommendation like with Worf in the Klingon Empire, where me and Adam White and Yuval, we all crossed our arms across our chest and turned our backs on you.
And the pain sticks, that was the worst part when I went down the corridor from one department to another. That hurt.
But no, the thing I always distinguish your shop from my shop from was that you make every year at that big thing we do, you make the interns we hunt for sport wear yellow vests, which I always thought was a little unsporting. But so be it. They knew what they were signing up for. Okay, so why don't we get the rank punditry out of the way, and then we can do the rank nerdery. Where do you see the? I can't even say it with a straight face. How do you see the presidential election going so far, Matt?
Well, I think it's going poorly for the incumbent. Let's just put it that way. Does that mean that it's a lost cause for Joe Biden and the Democrats? No, but it's definitely not looking very good. Let's just start off with the presidential approval rating. Biden is the least popular president since Jimmy Carter. He's certainly the least popular Democratic incumbent president since Jimmy Carter. If you could just go back, I mean, he's in far worse condition than either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and he much more closely resembles Carter than either of the successful two-term Democratic presidents in the modern era. I think there are many reasons. I think the most obvious reason is the increase in the price level under Biden. It's now prices have risen overall about 20% since Biden took office. Again, that's a record that is matched only by Carter, who served one term. And you see in poll after poll that the economy and prices are the most important issue for Americans, and they judge Biden very harshly on that. It's interesting. The country's in kind of a funk. It's been in a funk for about 20 years. I wrote about this for the new issue of Commentary magazine. And the right track, wrong track, people tend to dismiss it these days as kind of just being correlated with polarization. And, people, if they're Republicans, they think the country's on the wrong track with the Democrats in office and vice versa. The truth is, more people have thought this country's been on the wrong track than the right one since 2004. And we've had 10 elections every 2 years, biannual elections, since 2004. 9 out of those 10, one of the elected parts of our government switched hands, at least one. So there is something to the right track, wrong track. And that something is it's produced a very chaotic politics. The one exception since 2004 where nothing changed hands was the election of 2012. That was a weird election. It was a totally status quo election. Obama was reelected, the Republican House was reelected, and the Democratic Senate was reelected. And I went back and I looked, well, what was the spread on the wrong track, right track on election night 2012? The spread was minus 14, right? So that was the deficit between wrong track and right track. Right now, or at least a couple days ago when I was researching this piece for commentary, the spread is minus 41. So people are much, much more pessimistic about the state of things than they were when Obama was reelected in 2012. So that's all bad for Biden. What is Biden holding on to? Well, it's interesting. There's 6 swing states in my view. There are the 3 Sun Belt states, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and then the 3 Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. The 3 Sun Belt swing states are pro-Trump. Trump has them almost locked down. He has had sustained leads beyond the margin of error in all 3 for some time now. The 3 Rust Belt swing states, however, are not as locked down for Trump. In fact, Biden has slight leads in some polls of Wisconsin and Michigan. The Trump lead in Pennsylvania is about the margin of error, so all 3 of the Rust Belt states are competitive. Biden has to sweep them to win, but it's still plausible. And funnily enough, the reason it's still plausible is the one demographic that Biden is doing well with, maybe understandably, is senior citizens.
Yeah.
And that population in the 3 Rust Belt swing states is older and whiter than the rest of the country. And so that used to be Trump's constituency, but now it's more of a Biden constituency. So he still has a path there, but I think it's a pretty narrow one. And just finally, the other thing that makes this election weird, and there are so many things that make the election weird: 2 incumbents, 2 oldest candidates ever, 2 least liked candidates ever. We have this issue of the double haters. And when you're dealing with about a quarter of the electorate can't stand either candidate, things are kind of up for grabs because you don't know where these double haters will land. In 2022, the double haters landed for Democratic candidates, and that's why Republicans had a very disappointing midterm election. But this year, I don't know. With 2024, Biden is at the top of the ballot. This is the first time he will be at the top of the ballot since 2020. And I do think Republicans have been a little bit more successful in candidate selection this time around. So that makes for a very competitive race.
Yeah, so this gets at one of the things that drives me crazy about the life we have chosen, at least part of our life we have chosen, which is to do the TV punditry thing, right? Insofar as, like yesterday, I went on CNN, perfectly fine hit, perfectly legitimate news value questions, because this is where we are. Talk about the court in New York not hearing the gag order case, talk about the Bob Good stuff, and the immigration thing. And we'll get to the immigration thing in a second, but like the New York case means nothing politically. I mean, there's some interesting issues about freedom of speech and law and blah, blah, blah. But like,
right.
Like I texted, I hope I'm not getting him in trouble. I texted Sarah and David, the hosts of our excellent legal podcast, and I was like, hey, I got to go talk about this court not taking up the gag order thing. And Sarah responds with this answer about the Supreme Court not taking it up. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. That's helpful. But it's the New York State Court. And she's like, oh, I had no idea. Right. I mean, it just doesn't matter. And
we've moved on.
Yeah. And on the Bob Good thing, right? So the controversy is that Bob Good is a congressman from Virginia. He's the head of the House Freedom Caucus. He endorsed DeSantis in the primaries, and Trump is punishing him by endorsing his kind of January 6-y kind of opponent. Do we have a verdict in that? Do we have a result?
Well,
it was too close
as we
yesterday.
record this on Wednesday morning, that opponent, John McGuire, who's not only supported by Trump, but also by what was left of the Republican establishment that's kind of been recreated in Trump's image. He's leading by about 330 votes in this contested primary in Virginia. And so McGuire has declared victory while we record this podcast. But Bob Good has said, look, we're going to, obviously have recounts and maybe even pursue legal options. We will have to wait for mail-in and provisional ballots. But with 340, 50 votes, I don't know. I can see McGuire winning a very narrow election, but we'll see.
And there's something kind of poetic about Good losing in this weird upset to a populist uprising, given how he was the guy who knocked out Cantor, right? Wasn't he?
No, that was a guy who's no longer in Congress.
Maybe it's the same seat.
Bratt. That was Dave
Bratt. Okay, yeah, I knew it was.
Yes, it may be close to the same seat.
Yeah,
Dave Bratt was, I think, replaced by a guy named Denver Riggleman, who then left.
Right, that's
and
right.
then so.
Yeah.
In any case, your essential point that the revolution eats its own.
Yes.
I mean, that is obviously demonstrated here. And it also shows you, though, one more point is that the Freedom Caucus, Trump has a very complicated relationship with them. This is a group of, hard right congressmen. They really hated Kevin McCarthy. Many of them hate Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House. Many of them love Trump.
And lots of their voters love Trump.
And
which
lots
is
of their voters love Trump.
Yeah.
But Trump went against them, and he's gone against them. It's not just in this case. It's also his support for Speaker Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
He recently told Marjorie Taylor Greene, Johnson's greatest critic, be nice, Marjorie. Be nice to Mike. That's what the Republican Party has kind of come to now. It's kind of like a little, playground. Well, the teacher says, be nice to each other.
Well, it's also Dalton's advice in Roadhouse.
And maybe that's more like the better metaphor.
But I distracted myself off of my own point. Yeah. The only thing is like most of the punditry opportunities out there are either on micro stories that are going to be forgotten in 24 hours, or about sort of, Shakespearean is too generous, but sort of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills type drama between personalities that have nothing to do with issues, right? So like the Trump campaign is suing, is filed a cease and desist thing against Bob Good's campaign for putting Trump's name on his signs, making it seem like he endorsed him when he didn't. I think the Trump campaign has every reason to complain about that. That's not my point. My point is that the reason Good's in trouble is because of disloyalty, not on any issue, not on any substance. It's just pure soap opera-ness. And so like this morning on Morning Joe, it's all about, will Trump calling Milwaukee a horrible city and wanting to stay in Chicago during the Republican convention, will that cost him Wisconsin? And given how tight things are going to be, it could, but it's also stupid to talk about because you don't know. It's unknowable. And, like when at the end of the day, getting just to your point is like, given how narrow this is going to be in 3 to 4 swing states at most, right? At the end of the day, where some of these contests could come down to 5,000, 10,000, 300 votes, right? That means we can talk about this issue or that issue or this mistake or that mistake being dispositive, or we could talk about the weather, or we could talk about, whether or not some team won in some state that made everybody in a good mood that week. I mean, it's going to be so overdetermined and unknowable that I find the punditry right now exhausting to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. Again, this is the life we've chosen, but it really gets exhausting.
No, I mean, you do a lot more television than I do, and I totally feel the same way about what people are expected to comment on TV. I would say, I mean, the fact that it's going to be a close election, and I recall Michael Barone talking once about how, our presidential elections really resemble Senate elections more than anything else, because if you look at the Senate races over the past decade and a half or so, they're all very tight for the most part. The competitive ones, and on the presidential level, that's like you have, we'll have 6 Senate races
Right.
in the swing states that will determine who becomes president. You're right. On the one hand, it might lead you to despair and say, the closeness of the election, we have no way of knowing what will affect people's votes. On the other hand, you can say, well, just look at the fundamentals. You have a very unpopular president. You have people who hate this economy, are worried about the border, view Trump as a stronger and more effective leader, right or wrong. That's how they're telling pollsters they view him, and also look much more favorably upon Trump's term in office than they do about the current situation. And you have the fact that the map is expanding for Trump and shrinking for Biden. So I've talked about those 6 swing states in the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, but we also have Virginia tied.
Yeah.
2 high-quality polls now showing Virginia tied. We have Minnesota within the margin of error, 2 high-quality polls. I have been of the view that if Virginia is really in play, that will have a lot to do with the Hispanic voters in Virginia. And that means that people should start looking at New Mexico, too. When Republicans are being competitive in states they haven't won in 20 years, they haven't won Virginia in 20 years, they haven't won Nevada in 20 years. Well, maybe look at the other states that they haven't won for 20 years. One of them is New Mexico. Very few people poll it, but a very large Hispanic American population. So the map is expanding, or looks to be expanding, in ways for Trump that if you're Biden or the Democrats, you have to be worried. Now, the funny thing is, it seems like the Democratic Party and all of its hanger-ons and affiliates is much more worried about the election than Biden and his team. And Biden and his team seem to believe that at the end of the day, voters will go into the booth or fill out their mail-in ballot before they drop it off at the drop box and say,
or give it to the ballot harvester,
down the street. They'll say to themselves, do I really want to go through another 4 years of Trump? And they will vote for Biden as a result. That has always been Biden's theory of the case. They seem to believe, based on reporting from Axios just this morning on June 19th, that the reason Biden won in 2020 is that Americans made a moral judgment between Trump and Biden and voted for Biden, and that they'll make the same moral judgment in November of this year. I have to say, I disagree with that analysis of why Biden won in 2020. I think rather than a moral judgment, the electorate simply had enough of Trump's erratic behavior during the pandemic and punished Trump for that. And Biden, in contrast, seemed like a steady hand. He was also an invisible hand because he hardly campaigned. That wasn't really a moral judgment. It was more a performance-based judgment. But now that we have the example of Biden's performance predominating the election, I think it's causing many voters to either be uninterested in voting for Biden or to reevaluate Trump's performance, at least during the first 3 years of his presidency.
Yeah, but this sort of gets back to the point I was trying to make, and I did badly at, which is that it's vibes, right? I mean, I know it's a cliche now, but it's vibes. And there are people who are so appalled by Donald Trump, they can't comprehend, it's like fish don't know they're wet. When you are fully ensconced in one set of vibes, you cannot understand that somebody else isn't. And I think that works on both sides. And
right. Do the Nicole Wallace guests know they're there?
Yeah.
It's like fish, do they know that they're on the show, or that's just their whole world?
Or do they think that the micron, the micrometers of difference between all of the guests are actually substantive debates, but anyway, so like I just that's the problem with the punditry now is like everyone is putting Biden on the couch or his team on a couch or putting Trump on a couch and then putting the voters on the couch. And the only place I kind of disagree with you about this, and I know why you're doing it, and it's fine, and I do it too. It's the nature of these kinds of conversations, is to talk about why the American people voted this way or why the American people voted that. But again, 2020 was a really close election, like 2024 is going to be. And some people voted for one reason and other people voted for another reason. Obviously, half people voted for one guy and half the people voted for the other guy, basically. And, you've all mixed this point about how we talk about the electorate like it is this coherent, stable thing, when in fact you create electorates in every election and then they dissipate because it's going to be a different electorate the next election. And so part of my problem is I cannot stand when politicians say, after they win 51-49, the American people have spoken. Like, no, they haven't. Almost half of them said they don't like you, right? Mm-hmm. But that's how we end up anthropomorphizing the electorate as a single beast. When in reality, there are a lot of dumb people who are going to vote for really dumb reasons, and there are a lot of smart people who are going to vote for really dumb reasons, and there are going to be a lot of dumb people who vote for really smart reasons, and 1,000 places in between. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like saying, well, the people who saw, Furiosa opening weekend, they're not going to stand for this. No, it's like a bunch of different people who then, after they see the movie, go on and do their own thing. But you can't talk about, you have to generalize in a certain way. And my point is like, in a climate where issues don't matter and it's just mood, the talking about the people gets so infected with vibeology that it just gets exhausting.
Well, a couple things. I mean, the first is I do think issues matter here. I think inflation is a major issue. It's dogged Biden throughout his presidency. I think the border is a major issue. I really do. And there are communities throughout the country that are having to deal with the consequences of the border policies that Biden enacted. I also think that foreign policy is an issue in this election in a kind of a unusual way. It is just true that Biden's approval ratings went below 50% during the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan and never recovered. Sure. Never recovered. Now, that was also the time when the inflation first began to appear. So, again, it could be multiple things. But
surrender amidst high inflation is not ideal.
not a combination, right? And also kind of like a Jimmy Carter type thing.
Yeah.
And just the general sense, again, this is more vibes, I concede, that the world's out of control with the wars in the Middle East, with Ukraine, all of that. So I do think there are issues in this election.
No, can I just say, I agree with you entirely about that. I think that's entirely right. There are fundamentals, there are events, dear boy, right, that matter. My point is that the conversation between the campaigns and between their surrogates isn't about issues.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah.
Right. And so like when we're asked to talk about politics stuff, it's about competing schoolyard vibe stuff. I'm happy to talk about Ukraine and inflation and the border, which are totally legitimate issues.
Yeah.
But like who's persuading anybody at the margins on those issues in terms of between the campaigns?
Well, I think the Biden campaign has a vested interest in not talking about the issues because they all work against him, and Biden's friends in the media also probably are not that interested in talking about the issues. They want to talk about more of the vibes or cheap fakes or whatever. I do want to say something about the different electorates because I think that's a great point. It's a point that Sean Trendy, the election analyst at Real Clear Politics and an AEI non-resident fellow, also makes. And it cuts both ways, it seems to me, in this election. One, we've had 4 years of new voters entering the system since Trump was president, and what we find in the polls that the under 35 voters are much more open to Trump than one would have expected. They certainly dislike Biden, so that is a new electorate. The real question I think a lot of analysts are asking when they look at the 2024 races, what will be the level of engagement?
Right.
Because what we find is, as we conduct polls, is that the least engaged voters are the most pro-Trump.
Right.
And that if everyone was forced to vote, like some progressives would like, Trump would win in a landslide.
Yeah. Which is a first in modern American history that the Democrats would lose if everybody voted.
And so this is part of Biden's narrow path to re-election, is that, well, what is the electorate in November? If it's the committed electorate, then Biden has a pretty good shot. If it's the general presidential electorate, where just a lot of people become involved who normally don't participate in politics, but it's the president and we have the cult of the presidency in the United States, so people think, oh, hey, I'm going to get involved, then Trump is much better off. So that it is true. There will be a different group of voters in 2024 than we're used to. One final note on that is that the ethnic composition of Trump's vote is very different than certainly previous Republican nominees. And even in Trump's case, this coalition he's forming is much younger, and it's much more Hispanic, and it has a lot more African American males in it. It's much more multi-ethnic. So that too would be if it turns out to be the winning coalition, will be a very different type of coalition than any Republican president has enjoyed since the Eisenhower era.
Yeah. So one last thing on the punditry, and then we can move on to the important stuff. Can you steel man for me what the political calculation you think is? Like, I'm not asking for criticism. I'm actually sort of like let's imagine that you are actually a close confidant of the Biden campaign, which you may be. I suspect not, but I don't know.
No, not really.
But sort of steel man for me, Biden's announcement about this sort of DACA-like extension of amnesty stuff that he did yesterday. I mean, the policy and the legal stuff we can put off for another time. Just the pure politics of it, I'm trying to game it out, and I don't think I've quite gotten a clear picture on it.
Well, I think the most obvious explanation is that Biden is worried about his left. He has, in my view, governed from farther on the left than he campaigned.
For sure.
And he has always been concerned about his left. And I think the reason he's concerned about his left is he's having a lot of trouble with the middle. And so if the left goes too on issues like the Hamas-Israel war or issues like immigration, well, then he's really in deep trouble because there's no one left. So the unusual event wasn't so much the announcement the other day about this expansion of DACA to include the some 500,000 spouses who are here illegally but married to Americans. The kind of out of character moment was the previous week when he announced these executive changes to asylum policy in an attempt to slow down the border crossings, right? That was unusual because he hadn't done anything like that for, 3.5 years of his presidency. And he'd been kind of talking like he might do something about it, about the border, about asylum policy for months before they actually came out with the proposal. When he did that, he found that it didn't win him anything, that the right said it was a cheap trick, and the left immediately said that he had betrayed the rights of the migrants crossing into the Southwest.
And in fairness, they also said it was a cheap trick.
And so they did unify.
Yeah, it was a bipartisan critique.
That's like one of my favorite moments of the past year. It's been a terrible year in so many ways, but when all the campus madness was happening this spring with the encampments, I believe it was at the University of Alabama. I'm not sure, but there was the pro-Hamas encampment, and they were met with counter protesters, kind of pro-Israel, pro-Trump protesters, and yet, so they started screaming at each other, these two student groups. But then, within about a couple minutes, they both settled on the unified chant of "F Joe Biden." So it was like finally, he was bringing the country together. So that's my explanation. Is I think they're just worried about the left, and so he came out and did this in order to appease the immigrant right groups on the progressive side.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I also just hanging a lamp over immigration stuff, and doing it on the anniversary of DACA to boot. If he doesn't want people talking about immigration, this is a funny way to get people to stop talking about immigration. And I just feel like you could have done this in a way that would have gotten you 80% of the credit with those groups without sort of giving the kind of talking point they've given to sort of the Fox, the Republicans generally, of just sort of like, here's another amnesty, right? Because that is just not, it's just not great talking point.
Yeah, it doesn't really play well in this environment where you look at some of the internals of these polls on immigration. Again, I'm going to use it, the phrase you don't like, but the American people have turned pretty harshly.
No, when half of Hispanics are in favor of mass deportation.
Right. They're for the Trump proposals, which, just 8 years ago seemed beyond extreme to many people. But because of the border, for the past 3.5 years, the voters are very skeptical of immigration, illegal immigration mainly. And it would seem to make no sense to announce this policy. I do think it also speaks to a general incoherence to this administration that I most clearly see in their policy toward Israel. That was not the case when the Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, but has become increasingly confusing and incoherent in the quest for a ceasefire and the demands of some type of change in government in Israel. And that type of incoherence now you clearly see with the border. It may have just to do, and I'm going to, I'll raise the issue of Biden's age. It may have to do that with just the people around Biden not getting clear signals about where he stands on some of these issues. And that ambiguity allows, in some cases, progressives to kind of freelance policy.
Yeah.
But also results in kind of a miasma where you're not, okay, we'll do one thing that is meant to crack down on the border one week, and then the next week we'll do the opposite, and maybe that will satisfy someone.
Now it's sort of the Yogi Berra line about when you come to a fork in the road, take it.
Yeah.
No, I generally I agree with that. I and it's a cliche now, and we've all written it at one point or another. But part of the problem is Biden always saw himself as a centrist within the polls of the Democratic Party, and when those polls have zigged and zagged, but mostly zagged, leftward, he doesn't know how to triangulate anymore, and because there just aren't any conservative Democrats for him to, recalibrate his sensors, right? So he has to look at reasonable Republicans or something, or what he thinks is the center of American politics, and he's never been good at that.
Well, I think he thinks the center of American politics are his granddaughters.
Yeah, no, I think that's another big thing.
That is not the case.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think like he thinks it's funny you bring this up, because I've talked a lot on here about the Latinx thing and the birthing person thing and all that kind of stuff, and I think the best defense of it, which I do not normally defend it, but is that if you are surrounded by a entourage of advisors who claim to represent minority groups, marginal groups, that kind of thing, and they tell you this is the language you have to use, and then you go out on stage and you say, I want to welcome all my Latinx friends and and all the birthing persons or whatever. You think you're being inclusive because the people you consider to be avatars of those groups are telling you those things. The problem is that the advisor with a PhD from Brown in gender studies actually is not representative of any of those groups, right? And so I've thought for a while that Biden's grandkids, he thinks, are the youth. And that's how he resets and touches base with the youth, as he asks his grandkids these questions. And his grandkids are being sincere, but they got, the equivalent of Pauline Kaelism for young lefties.
Yeah. Well, this ties into your larger point about the fallacy of composition, right? I mean, the grandkids represent some youth, but not everybody. And I do think it's related to the university's colonization of the broader culture and the Democratic Party. And so what you're describing is the monoculture of the university, where everyone thinks the same way. And so what do you mean people don't like Latinx, right? We all agree that this is how we should refer to people of Hispanic descent. And then you step off campus or get outside the university town, the latte town, as David Brooks called them, and you're going to find something very different. It reminds me of, you will recall, because I remember you engaged in this debate, but 20 years ago or so, when the critics of conservatism were accusing the right of engaging in epistemic closure. Right? I think the progressivism now is almost a perfectly sealed cocoon of epistemic closure. And I mean, obviously the right has its own media cocoons and its own problems, but much harder to just level that accusation in one direction these days. And progressivism has become its own kind of just internal universe, very self-referential. And I do think that's become a problem for the White House, that they're not willing to engage or even really go outside that bubble very much. And again, that the age thing is slightly related, makes the problem worse, because look, Biden is just a fact. He gives fewer press conferences than his predecessors. He gives fewer major interviews than his predecessors. When he does give a major interview, like with Caitlin Collins of CNN last 2 months ago or so, he made news by drawing a red line against our ally Israel that almost everyone backed away from, right? So he, because of his age, I think he's even more removed from the fact that this is a complicated country. There are two parties that are both deeply divided and narrowly divided. And in order to succeed, you need to have at least some understanding of what the other side is up to and thinking.
Yeah. I mean, the inability of both these guys to pass an ideological Turing test is really kind of
Yeah.
kind of remarkable. All right. Speaking of which, so I had I went on a bit of a weird diatribe on here on the solo podcast a while back, and about my not entirely unique but sort of minority views on what was and what is neoconservatism. And you came up to me at an event for Yuval and said how you enjoyed it. And I said, yeah, well, that's because the whole thing was aimed at about 8 people and you're one of them. And I repeated that story last week on here, and I heard from literally dozens of people
Oh, wow.
that said, I may not be part of that 8, but I liked it too. So like we're into the meaty mid 40s
the
of
true
people.
remnant here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So first of all, well, let me do it this way rather than recounting the entire theory all over again. My basic view is that neoconservatism did not begin as a form of foreign policy. It began as a disillusionment with the utopian or zealous reformist, the reformist zeal of communism, New Deal, Great Society, all three, or individually, or in combination. And it is better understood as a sociological phenomenon about people shedding one tribe and through the power of empirical observation joining another tribe. What say you, sir?
Well, I think it was a great way to kind of formulate or restate what neoconservatism was and how that same process of disillusionment may be occurring on some corners of the liberal left today. And that's what I really appreciated about it. I also liked the fact that you talked about neoconservatism in stages. And the way that I always talk about the subject is to basically lay out 3 waves of neoconservatism. The first was that initial group of social thinkers, mainly social scientists or journalists in the case of Irving Kristol, who did become disillusioned with the Great Society and the gap between the promise of the Great Society and the results. And then eventually the realization that the policies of the Great Society may have indeed made the problems it was meant to address even worse. And then I talk about the second wave of neoconservatives, which happens about 5-10 years after this initial group, which is really, that's when it becomes more about foreign policy and about kind of standing up for democracy, reinvigorating America's defenses, opposing the Nixon and Kissinger policy of detente or coexistence with the Soviet Union. And then there's the final wave of neoconservatives, the third wave of neoconservatives, who don't really start from a place of disillusionment, as you said. They're already Republicans,
right?
But they believed and helped articulate George W. Bush's foreign policy of the freedom agenda, and also this idea that America should be the benevolent hegemon of the world and be involved in all corners of the world in order to further the cause of freedom and American security. And that third wave is the group that I think most people believe they are referring to when they use this epithet neocon, though it's become so divorced from anything real that it's just used as kind of a slur. But it's certainly not the origin story that you laid out, and so that was grateful for you to remind people.
So I obviously I agree with all that. And for listeners who don't know, we should say that one of the reasons why you're one of those 8 people is that you wrote this magnificent book, The Right, the 100-year history of the conservatism and blah blah blah. We'll put in the show notes. I just can't remember. The subtitles
you got
screw
it.
me
That's
up.
the 100-Year War for American conservatism.
There you go. Close enough, right?
Yeah. And blah blah blah.
And blah
That's
blah
on the
blah.
paperback. Yeah. We added that blah 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 to the paperback.
So, if you're at AEI, I can't quite tell. You might want to, because subtitles are the bane of my existence. When I was working on Ben Wattenberg's book, Values Matter Most, which is a fairly pithy, I don't love the title, but it's a fairly pithy title. But then Ben was always the kind of guy who wanted, if you could getting a 5-pound bag of oranges would be great. But if you could get 6 or 7 pounds in a 5-pound bag, that would be even better. And so he had this subtitle was Value Matters Most, how a third party or a fourth party or a fifth party could possibly win. And the subtitle went on like Joe Biden wandering off in the snow. And anyway, I agree with all that. My only And I think we may just have to inter the term neocon, even though I think it's unfair, right? But it's just been so beaten up that it's like sometimes these terms have to lie around for a generation or two, and then someone picks them back up because they can reinvent their meaning, kind of thing. I mean, but how do you explain? Your version is the standard correct version, I would say. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that you start the story with Irving and his crowd, right? Because Irving's the guy who is the first one to get called a neocon. So like, that's where you would, if the nomenclature starts there, the story starts there. Mm-hmm. But part of my point is if you go back and you look at those dudes around National Review, Max Eastman, James Burnham,
totally.
Right? Some people do call James Burnham the first neocon. And if I describe for you in the abstract, a group of intellectuals who started out on the left, some of whom were Jewish, a lot of whom were former communists, who grew disillusioned with the left, got purged from the left, got ridicule heaped on them from the left, and moved right and became basically full-fledged conservatives. You could say, oh, you're talking about the neoconservatives, but I could be talking about half the people who founded National Review. And so what do you think about that point about like, yeah, we can't technically call it neoconservatism, but they were kind of like the John the Baptists of neoconservatism because it's the same sociological story.
Well, thank you for reminding me of another part of your monologue that I liked.
It was a big monologue.
It was a big monologue. I got to a couple in my first answer. We'll talk about this in my second answer. I think you're absolutely right. And what I most appreciated about that argument is how it reflects poorly on neoconservatives' critics, the critics of neoconservatism. Because as you said in the Ruminant, the people who were attacking Irving Kristol and then Norman Podhoretz, who is the representative writer of that second wave I talked about, for being interlopers and for being, war hawks and incorrigible. Well, they held up this earlier generation as kind of the lodestar of the old right, when in fact this earlier generation had gone through a similar process of disillusionment and were very hawkish, more hawkish actually, than the later neoconservatives. The better dead than red argument was all over the place in the early post-war period on the American right.
I mean, neocons as a rule were not for rollback. They were just for containment.
Containment, exactly. They were more moderate on foreign policy compared to the old right standard bearer, Barry Goldwater, right? So I do think that that's a very important point. What I also think is that it, gets back to the kind of the eternal recurrence we're talking about, where, these terms just show up again and again. And so the writer and now publisher Jonathan Bernitsky did some work on a, as of yet, unpublished biography of Irving Kristol, but he wrote a long essay, and very good essay, on Irving Kristol and his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, for National Affairs back in 2012 or 2011, I think.
Yeah, some of it.
And there he found instances of Kristol using neocon or neoconservative in correspondence in the 50s. So that appellation was in circulation before
It's stuck.
the socialist writer Michael Harrington accused Irving of being a neoconservative, just as we go through this continual refurbishment of new right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the new conservatives were Russell Kirk and Peter Viereck in the 1950s. And then the new right of the 1970s were populists like Paul Weyrich and the Nick Pack, and some of Reagan's allies in the late 70s. And now we have a new right again, which is, you know, become an umbrella term for all sorts of characters, from the integralists to the kind of dime store Nietzscheans to the national conservatives.
And this doesn't, I mean, so like, then we can get into the very confusing, trying to explain to people how little the quote unquote old right had to do with William F. Buckley, Russell Kirk, or any of those guys, right? So the old right of the turn of the 20th century, who, like, if you're going to do the begats, the only one, I mean, Mencken matters, Knock matters, although there was a very good piece in NR a couple months ago about how Buckley's relationship with Albert J. Knock is overblown, which I found interesting, and he sources a lot of Buckley's thinking about the Remnant more to people like Dwight McDonald and some others. I thought it was interesting. It's and fair enough, but like we've talked about this before offline. You know, when I started working on my first book, people were like, "Oh, you gotta read the old right. You gotta understand the old right, and blah 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 blah, and you gotta look up this guy like J.T. Flynn and all these people." And it turns out a lot of them were, first of all, former leftists, but second of all, they were not recognizably conservative in a sort of post-World War II kind of way for the most part. Even the people who were conservative in their curmudgeonliness or their opposition to the prevailing ethoses of government and politics, like Knock, whatever, just really hard to categorize and really hard to put in a coherent kind of group. And then we've talked about this before, but our friend Ron Radosh, who's done all sorts of great and important work, when he was younger and more of a committed man of the left, he wrote this fascinating book, is just sort of a historical document called Prophets on the Right, Profiles of Conservative Critics of American Globalism. And the people he cites are Senator Robert A. Taft, fair enough, right? That guy, John T. Flynn, who I mentioned before, who was a left-wing columnist for the New Republic in the 1930s that Bill Buckley refused to publish when he launched National Review. Oswald Garrison Villard, Lawrence Dennis, and Charles Beard.
Right.
And Charles Beard was the paradigmatic left-wing economic historian that I read in college. And the idea that you would situate him on the right, which he was a passionate isolationist in World War II, kind of turned kooky. But it just shows you, like, pre-World War II, talking about what conservatism was gets really hard really fast.
Well, I think you hit on kind of the key markers there, which are isolationist and kooky, to describe the pre-World War II. Certainly the right in the 1920s, or parts of it. I mean, there was a more constitutional right that actually William Howard Taft kind of represented at the time, and that's been overlooked in a lot of scholarship. And in truth, I should spend more time reading it and writing about it. But the real dividing line, in my view, has always been on the issue of American engagement overseas and American global leadership. And if you were part of the right prior to the Second World War, what that meant was you, certainly in the 30s, you opposed Roosevelt's domestic policy and you opposed his foreign policy.
Yeah.
That was it. You were not, and indeed, William F. Buckley Jr., when he was a young man, he opposed Roosevelt's domestic policy and he opposed his foreign policy. The big change comes after World War II, where with the American victory, with the lessons of Pearl Harbor very much on many people's minds, and with the growing threat of Soviet communism and the betrayal at Yalta and the fact that the Stalin now ruled half of Europe from Moscow, conservatives retained their opposition to FDR's domestic policy and continued to want to roll back the New Deal, but they embraced not just containment, which was the Truman policy. The Democratic policy was containment. The conservatives embraced rollback of communism. And so that required a very different posture toward the outside world. And so figures like Beard, or figures like Charles Lindbergh, or figures like Robert Taft even, they didn't quite fit in. And, I became fascinated by Robert Taft while I was writing my book. And I do think he's a very interesting and in many ways admirable figure. And there's in fact a monument to him on Capitol Hill. But he died of cancer in 1953. And after he was a very big critic of NATO and of the general American involvement post-war in Europe and the building up of the American defense establishment, security establishment, he dies. And so we don't know how he would have continued to fit in, right? I mean, instead, the leadership on the right passes briefly to McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, who actually was a Cold Warrior, both externally in fighting the Soviets and more famously and more notably internally in countering internal subversion. And then after McCarthy's censure in 1954, the right very briefly coalesces around the senator from California, Bill Noland, but then he loses in 58. So they're like, oh, now who do we have? Well, they find Barry Goldwater, and of course, Goldwater is that exemplary figure who wants to end the New Deal, wants to roll back FDR's revolution in the federal government, but he also wants to defeat communism, and he believes that defeating communism is the more important task.
So the thing I don't understand, so I agree with you entirely about this opposition to FDR thing, right? Like it took me forever to figure out what right wing meant in the 1930s, and it meant being a critic of FDR. And then for the more serious left, it meant being a critic of communism, but that was more understandable. But you had lots of good liberal progressive types who were anti-communist, even into the, like people who become sort of the Arthur Schlesinger types in the 1940s, and the Americans for Democratic Action, crowd. They were progressives at home, but they were also anti-communist, right? And it just took a little while for that sort of world to coalesce. But the knee-jerk opposition to FDR's foreign policy, this is a purely factual question for me, because FDR says screw you to the London Economic Conference, I want to say in 1934, which threw the world in turmoil and sent this signal that America wasn't going to cooperate with any of this globalist stuff. William Leuchtenberg says it was the signal that the FDR administration was going to be nationalist. And what I just don't know is, like, when did it become obvious? Was it Lend-Lease? When does FDR become considered an internationalist? So much so that people with FDR derangement syndrome just oppose it regardless, because it's not early New Deal.
No, well, and FDR's early foreign policy was pretty restrained, right? And he avoided American involvement in the Second World War for as long as he could. I mean, he waited until Pearl Harbor too, right?
Yeah, I mean, like Woodrow Wilson, he liked to run against going to war and then going to war.
Then it's a trend. So I think what you would look at is the move toward assisting uh, the Allies and the British in particular after the Second World War begins in September 1939. And then there are specific policy proposals, whether it's Lend-Lease, whether it's the draft, whether it's the rearmament that FDR's critics oppose. And those critics tend to be the same figures, not always, but tend to be the same figures who also oppose the New Deal. And there's a remarkable document that I write about from 1937 called the Conservative Manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
And it was printed and it was in newspapers, and the headline was a manifesto by conservatives. And it was really a group of senators mainly, and mainly Southern Democrats, who wanted to kind of form an internal faction opposed to the New Deal, especially opposed to the second New Deal. Mm-hmm. And they listed their kind of tenets of belief and their general anti-statism, pro-market views, their hostility toward organized labor as just another monopoly. Mm-hmm. These are all economic policy views that map on very clearly to the conservative movement in the decades after. And Southern Democrats' foreign policy gets complicated too, because often they were a little bit more hawkish, and they also kind of liked the federal spending that came with military bases.
For sure,
and, you know, so that kind of persuasion slowly becomes infused with conservatism and with the Republican Party, you know, in a process that takes decades. But you can see it right there in microcosm in the late 30s.
Yeah, but this also just speaks to how the 1920s and 1930s were really just a different country, different planet in a lot of ways. Because, like, I always try to explain to people, a lot of the most influential and important politically, not necessarily intellectually, but politically, some of the most important progressives in journalism and also just in politics were Southerners who were very much for all sorts of, like, minimum wage, this, healthcare, that kind of stuff, all the economic stuff of progressivism, but we're also just soaked to the bone segregationist racists.
Yeah, right.
And, you know, we're supposed to believe today that those things can't go together, but, like, Josephus Daniels was, you know, a serious racist, and so was Woodrow Wilson, and so just the associations of categories that we think are organic and sort of compelled by nature to just sort of go together, they don't necessarily have to go together. I mean, you can be a socialist and a pro-lifer. You can be a racist and a progressive. I mean, these things can get glommed onto each other in weird ways. And I do think it was FDR's presidency which rewrote, and then of course World War II, that just rewrites all of these categories in ways that make it really difficult to look through that portal of that, you know, 15 years and really understand what you're seeing on the other side.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, we are still living in FDR's world, certainly domestically. He kind of recreated the government. He built up this federal government that would have been unrecognizable and terrifying to most Americans prior to the New Deal, prior to the Great Depression, and it's still terrifying to many Americans. And then in the post-war, you know, in the foreign policy dimension, we're still living in Harry Truman's world. You know? And so maybe FDR has a paternal role there too. What's interesting is that the Truman's world seems to be deteriorating more rapidly than FDR's, and FDR's is still pretty much in place with the entitlements, the idea of entitlement that he established, the idea of the regulatory state that he didn't establish it. You obviously write about Wilson kind of gave us a preview of coming attractions, but he definitely turned it into a real thing that reaches into every corner of American life.
Wilson creates it. FDR brings it up to scale.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then the Supreme Court, as part of the way in which they avoided the court packing scheme, validated it. Right.
Yeah.
And so I do think we're beginning to see actual pushback, and we're awaiting this decision from the Supreme Court this term on the so-called Chevron deference, about the how free regulatory agencies are just to simply govern America without congressional approval, without legislative direction. If the court rules in a way that overturns that deference and that demands more of Congress, that would be kind of whittling away at the foundations of FDR's New Deal. And of course, I say this knowing that we live in a time where I am reminded constantly by my critics that conservative people, the conservative movement, has achieved nothing. We have nothing to achieve. I mean, and yet you think about what might be happening through the court on Chevron. You think about what the court has already done on Janus and on the public sector unions. By the way, public sector unions, FDR also hated.
Right.
He didn't think they should have the right to bargain against themselves.
Right.
But obviously affirmative action, which is a later policy, a kind of an LBJ, Richard Nixon policy. But we are slowly kind of, I think, and helpfully increasing the sphere of individual freedom and personal responsibility at home. I cheer those developments. I worry about what's happening overseas with the erosion of the post-war order that America created and America led for 80 years. It seems to me to be very rickety these days, and that I find much more worrisome than developments at home.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this Neil Ferguson essay, but we're over time, and I have a new question that I think I want to close on. Okay. So I agree with all that analysis. The conservative legal movement was a 50-year, took 50 years to do, but it's paying off with real substantive successes. And as you know, Yuval and some of our other friends, they kind of want to sort of recreate that story with something. It can't be the exact same thing because they're just different. Being lawyers is different than being a politician and whatnot. But try to figure out a way to replicate that with restoring Congress, right? Mm-hmm. To get Congress to actually do its job. And it took 50 years to get enough conservative justices and judges, really, right? Because it's not just the Supreme Court, to move the Overton window to where you could get someone like Elena Kagan saying, we're all textualists now, or we're all originalists now. And obviously that wasn't quite true, but it was progress, right? It was progress to get Bill Clinton to say the era of big government is over, even though it wasn't. And so the thing, though, it seems to me, the irony we have is that at just the moment where the court is doing the things that demonstrate it was all worthwhile, right? And demonstrate that the conservative legal movement would pay off by doing it the right way, by working within institutions, developing arguments, developing cadres of serious people who do their homework. The people who are about to take the reins or have taken the reins of the Republican Party are like, to hell with those cucks. Let's get some real, let's get some real people in there. Pam Biondi and Judge Janine for SCOTUS, and that threatens to blow up the whole thing. And at the same time, the Supreme Court is about to, if it rules the right way on the Chevron stuff, really kind of force Congress's hand to start taking itself seriously at precisely the moment it has basically lost even institutional memory of how to do legislation. And so I'm just wondering, as these tectonic plates are colliding, where are you on a scale of hopefulness versus pessimism on Congress stepping up to do the job and the courts continuing to actually deliver on these kinds of successes?
Well, I would say first, people do what they have to do, and
Mhm.
so if the court demands more of Congress, and Congress believes that there will be a penalty exacted against it if they fail to do what's demanded of them, then I think they will act. And I am
Bless
looking.
your heart.
I am looking at what's happening with the bump stock case, right?
Mhm.
Because that was a decision the court ruled that it was not the government was not authorized simply to ban this type of supplement to your firearm, but allowed that Congress has every right to do it. And that decision by the court was met with, I think, bipartisan, not full bipartisan condemnation, but enough people on both sides said, well, maybe we should actually pass a law to ban these. And if they do, okay, well, they did what they're supposed to do. Now, maybe not. Maybe there will be other interests at work. I guess my larger cheerful pessimism is based on the fact that, you can change the institutional rules of Congress. That might help. But at the end of the day, Congress is us.
Mhm.
The House in particular is an extremely representative institution. And I don't know if you remember last month or whenever it was when Marjorie Taylor Greene got into a fight with AOC and another young Democratic congresswoman, and they were trading insults. And
Bleach blonde butch build or something. Yeah.
It was like an episode of a reality show, and everyone was horrified. I tell my wife, I'm not horrified. This is America. They're Americans. This is our people. And we have a representative government, still do. And so we're going to get representatives who represent us. So I guess I just have a view of the American people, which may be more grounded in fact. And the facts may not be very positive, but that's just who we are. And so we'll see what we get. But until you start helping improve maybe the let me just say the foundations of the character of the people, right? Once we start improving the state of the American family, the state of the American church, the state of our neighborhoods, all of these institutions that form our characters that have been in slow motion collapse, well, then if we improve those things, then we'll get a better class of congressperson. And that's the work we have in front of us.
We're going to have you back on soon, so I can, because we finally hit a point of disagreement.
Oh, but just at
an
the
hour
end?
and 12 minutes. No, look, I first of all, I'm going to have my team make a GIF of you talking as your room's catching fire and you saying, "This is fine."
Not quite what I said.
Look, just because it's representative doesn't mean it's good, right?
No, no, of course not.
And doesn't mean that it's not worrisome, which is sort of what you said, and I agree with you. I mean, that scene, all that was missing was for them to throw white wine in each other's faces. And but where I disagree with you is that sort of is you're doing a version of the composition fallacy about Congress, right? Where you say if Congress feels the need, right?
Right.
First of all, the demand that Congress do things that would be in the interest of the country has been quite intense for quite a long time. The problem is that Congress, which I don't believe is nearly as representative as you sort of imply, the actual Congress critters are not answerable to the wider electorate, right? To the median voter, to the representative voter. They're answerable to the lunkheads who control the primaries. And one of the things we know about primary voters is that not only do they not really like the other party, they hate their own party, right? They just hate the other party more. And that creates an incentive structure that you have, I mean, you know all this stuff, so I can shorthand it. You have people who will only do the bare minimum for the public good that doesn't get them primary.
Right.
And that is not the institutional arrangement most conducive to being handed the baton from the Supreme Court to do public policy.
Well, so this is like the composition fallacies are flying all over the place, because what I think you are doing, sir, is you're amplifying the worst parts of Congress and making them the center. And in my view, the bulk of congressmen of both parties are not actually lunkheads, but they just are drowned out by the reality TV stars that we have in our politics, which is a function of our culture.
Sure.
So
they're autonomous drones working in fear of the lunkheads rather than lunkheads themselves.
The real problem, the real problem is we're so narrowly divided. When you have, this is the issue: is that if it does confirm your point about candidate selection, by the way. If Republicans hadn't nominated a lot of lunkheads in 2022, the House majority would be much larger than it is today.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, the foreign assistance bill would have been passed much earlier.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, the narrow division in our country is what's causing the holdup in a lot of ways. So I guess that's maybe our difference is in where the problem is originating. And for me, the problem is a little bit deeper, because it has to do with kind of just the state of American society and culture. And then that is, in my view, actually channeled pretty well in what we see in our politics. And I'm maybe,
you can't have it both ways.
Maybe improving primaries will change that, but I kind of don't see it.
You can't have it both ways. You can't say I'm being unfair to the vast majority of the members of Congress who aren't lunkheads, and then say the reason why Congress behaves like lunkheads is because of our sick and decaying national culture.
No, well, the problem is we have a culture that is working. It's just totally invisible and doesn't draw attention to itself. And the culture, the parts of our culture that aren't working, those are the ones that people take such great pleasure in both participating in and observing from afar.
Yeah. All right, we're gonna leave it on that note of agreement. We're gonna leave it there. Matt, it's always a pleasure to have you on. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk in complete sentences, without hearing a dear friend of mine say, "Hold on one second," and then 5 minutes later say, "Sorry for monologuing." So. And I only bring this up because I know Pod is listening, and it's great fun to make fun of him, but I love him dearly. All right, Matt Continetti, thank you very much, and we'll hope to have you back.
Thank you, Jonah.